Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this. This is very exciting. And thank you, Lonnie, for all of the work you've done to make this possible. This is such an important initiative, and I appreciate everybody who's here in the room today. I'm delighted to talk to you about this book, which I adore and have adored for many years. No one was happier than I was when Netflix decided to treat this book and to try to understand it and unpack it and commit it to the screen. I thought it was wonderful. I hope we can talk about that in our Q&A. I'd like to talk a little bit about it in my remarks, but I wanted to begin. I asked everyone to pay attention to the scene that begins on page 40, when the very complicated tea party commences. But first, I want to start just the moment that John Ballou enters the room. So John Ballou, of course, is Claire Kendry's husband. She calls him Jack. And all the important events really come together, I think, or important information come together in this scene. And of course, no one has more impact on what happens in this book than Jack Ballou. He enters the room and he encounters his wife, Claire, among two of her friends, Irene Redfield, who is our unreliable narrator, and their friend, Gertrude. I think this scene is great because it's so much about perception, the entire book, or people who they appear to be. Is Irene reliable? We know already by this moment that she's not a reliable narrator. She's not a good reader of people. She did not even recognize her own friend until earlier when they meet on the roof of the Drayton Hotel. It's Claire who has to come up to Irene and look at her and say, "Don't you recognize me, Irene?" I think this is on page 18. So we know that Irene is not a good reader of people, but we are treated once again to the world through Irene's eyes when she regarding Jack Ballou. She says he had a soft mouth, somewhat womanish, set in an unhealthy looking dough-colored face. Irene decided, nothing unusual about him, unless it was an impression of latent physical power. So Jack comes into the room and she starts to read him, and she sees him as, in some ways, unremarkable. And then he drops a bomb and greets his wife with the term nig. And at this point in the book, this is the first time we're introduced to this term. It's a good place to start because the book was actually supposed to be called Nig. That was Larsen's desire. When she was writing this book, it was in the wake of controversy that was set off by my dear friend Carl Van Vechten, who Andy referenced a while ago. Van Vechten has been someone I've been pretty much consumed with since I found out about him when I was in college myself. He wrote a book in 1926, and I won't say the term, but the N-word, heaven. It was a term that was used a lot in the time to refer ironically to segregated seating spaces in public theaters. Another term was buzzards roost, and Black people used it, ironically, the way we use the N-word. It's kind of full of history and meaning and, kind of that bitter humor that Langston Hughes would call, Black humor, laughing to keep from crying. Van Vechten used that term. It's a sort of longer story, but he certainly felt entitled to do so. And the net result was it made him very wealthy. The book went through, I think, 9 printings in 4 months. It's still very impressive for today, 100 years later. So Larsen very explicitly wanted to capitalize on the popularity and the notoriety, she said. She wrote to Van Vechten. They were very good friends. And you might have noticed she dedicates the book to Van Vechten and his wife, Vanya Marinoff. She did a lot in this book to signal her affiliation with Van Vechten at a time when that was very controversial and it was very deliberate. She enjoyed herself the notoriety of her relationship with Van Vechten, and she wanted to translate it into dollars, literally, in this book. But Knopf published Van Vechten's book, and for that reason, that's why Larsen's book ends up at Knopf, because Van Vechten introduced Larsen to his publisher, Alfred Knopf. And they did not want to go down that road again. So Larsen did not get her wish. And the book was called Passing. So this is an important moment, though, because, of course, this book is not only about perception and bodies, but it's also about language. And in many ways, it is about this word. This word is a container of history. It changes the energy in the room. Jack Ballou comes in, a nondescript white guy, 35, 40, nothing remarkable to Irene, but he says this term, and suddenly this is a scene that is full of violent potential. And it is also a scene now about race. Gertrude is uncomfortable. And if you read the pages that preceded this page, you know that Gertrude in some ways the odd person out here. Irene and Claire, they're in some kind of contest. They're certainly in a relationship and trying to revive a relationship, but it is uncomfortable, and it is uncomfortable for Irene even more than Claire. And what Claire does not know, of course, is that Irene is, deeply ambivalent, not only about this relationship, but really, I think in some ways her own Blackness. Something that I love about this book is how much it plays with interior and exterior worlds. So many pivotal moments happen in the interior spaces. And even this gathering is happening inside in some ways for a reason. Both Claire and Irene, and of course Gertrude, are light enough to pass. But in 1920s and even in New York City, there were so few public places for Black and white people to congregate at all, so that these interior spaces are important because they're unique for people who outside of these settings would have to really obey the choreography of segregation. But in this space, and this is the most kind of placid and it's a kind of everyday setting, in a parlor, having people over for tea. There's nothing outstanding about this, but some outstanding things are happening underneath the surface. And Larsen is playing a lot with that in this book. There are no people jumping out of airplanes, in this book. People are around tables having meals and talking, but, literally, as Zora Neale Hurston would say, passing the world, in their mouths, really, and enacting this very dangerous play here. And there's a lot of laughter, in these scenes, and something, to ask students, what is being enjoyed here? We know Claire as the architect of the whole scene, and really the life she's created. She's getting a lot of pleasure out of this. Claire is not victimized by this person. So enter Jack Ballou with his, racist language, and it just gets worse as he feels free. He feels he's among white people. He feels free to express his deep disdain for Black people, a really violent disdain for Black people. And these Black women are laughing, they're at the instigation of Claire. There's nothing funny about it. It's terrifying. It's absurd. And of course, that's something that's giving rise to a lot of the laughter. But Claire is taking a deep humor in this. For Claire, this marriage is just an extension of her desire to play with identity, to experience her own power. I think it's so very meaningful that in the 1920s, we have this encounter and this white man coming in here, dropping this racist language. And this is not a story, though, about Black women who are being victimized by this man or this language. So yet again, back to this term and what it means is this is a really, really hard book to teach in the here and now. I'm sure I'm not the only person, imagining how this might play in the classroom. And we can have a discussion about that. But the bottom line is, during the Harlem Renaissance, Black writers were so much of the struggle around establishing a Black identity was about establishing mastery over language and over narratives that had been used to denigrate and minimize and dehumanize Black people, like that word, and transforming it and making use of it, making meaning out of it. And that's literally what's happening in this scene. Here's a word I always tell my students, of course, we talk about, the word and what it means. And then we have discussions about what it means, that it's in the music, they consume, comedians they adore use it, on stage. What does that mean? And it's a big question, and it's a question about identity, and about the power of these utterances. But I tell them, no matter how you feel about it, and no matter how Dave Chappelle feels about it, no one was ever lynched without being called that word before, during, and after. No one was lynched. Mr. Johnson was never lynched, if you get my drift. So this word is more than a container of violence. It is an expression of violence. It is rhetorical violence. So here we are in the scene, and watching Claire play with it, and actually encourage Jack to use it for her own amusement and for her own sense of play, I think is something worth noting, and something that connects this book to the here and now, and what our students are consuming, and what they're asking about language, what's really happening, because she's the one who seems to be in control here. But you've read the book and you know what happens. There's a very limited sense of control. And I really would put my money on that. Claire knows this, right? She's milking this for what it's worth. She's not interested in safety. She's interested in danger. And this is a very dangerous position she's putting everyone in. Claire enjoys life on the knife's edge. It's interesting to pull back and say, what are we looking at here? We know these women are Black. It does not occur to Jack. So what does the scene look like? Which is why the Netflix film, I think, is really useful. Getting students to understand and to imagine how much, race really does reside in language. Jack himself says, I know Black people, when I see them. He doesn't use these polite terms, of course. On page 41, you can get as Black as you want, as you please, as far as I'm concerned. So what is race then? What is a relationship between race and perception? And frankly, as someone who's capable of or understanding or identifying race, Irene is no better. As I said a few minutes ago, Irene couldn't even recognize Claire when she didn't even recognize a Black woman standing in front of her. So who is it then who holds the ultimate knowledge, understanding about race? It certainly is not Irene, although in this book she presents herself again and again as a kind of arbiter of racial understanding. As I said, this is so much a book about the language stories that bodies tell, and how much race, of course, is what's happening beneath the surface. It's a book that shows us that race is often relational. None of these women are visible to Jack as Black here inside this home, in his own home. On the street, however, several chapters later, you all have probably read, the moment when Jack recognizes Irene's Blackness. It's only when he sees her in intimate connection with a Black woman who is visibly Black, who has brown skin. And then he is forced to recognize what he could not see earlier, which is that Irene is not who he thought she was. And by extension, Claire is not either. So it's again, I think the book is really fascinating, this kind of moving inside and outside, and how literally with a different light, we are different people according to who sees us and when and who we are with. I'd like to take your attention now to 41, when Irene is, after Jack says with so much certitude, I know Black people, Irene says, she starts to laugh. And she experiences what she often experiences looking at Claire. She says she had the sensation of gazing into the eyes of some creature utterly strange and apart. Even though she recognizes Claire, she finds her alien at the same time, inscrutable, if you will. And we might say that this is about the effectiveness of Claire's the masks that she wears throughout this book, but also Irene's inability to really perceive her friend, to understand her friend, but also through the haze of her own unreconciled desires for this woman. And she picks up a cigarette in that moment, and this happens throughout the book. Claire is associated with fire, of course, and with that's the sensual pleasure Irene receives from smoking. And you might have noticed the scene when we meet Gertrude. One of the first things Irene notices about Gertrude is that she's not smoking. I talked about this a little bit in my introduction. I love the way this book speaks to the context. This is a moment when women are smoking outside in public, and it's literally causing a panic. I think I wrote about this in the introduction. The Surgeon General actually issues a warning because it's seen as so rebellious, and of course it's so deeply erotic, and for women to be doing this in public. At the same time, they're cutting their hair and shortening their hemlines. I mean, my goodness, what's next? So the fact that Irene is processing always, using the cigarette to both, if you will, lubricate and repress those feelings she has for Claire is very telling. And of course, there's a nice foreshadowing here, what happens later on in the book. So I want to just, we have, much more time, of course, together, but I want to talk a bit about, in terms of this book and what's happening, just even this moment, inside a parlor, sitting still. Larsen has scenes like this in the book that's often taught, was published. There were, as a companion to this book. There's a Rutgers edition that has both Quicksand and Passing, and you maybe have read. Quicksand is also another extraordinary book like this book, both particular and universal, psychological and historical, theatrical, this book is, and Quicksand too, and very intellectual, also deeply sensual and surgical. She's playing with sensation. She, in that book, written just a year before, we were able to watch her main character, and there are lots of lush descriptions of interior spaces and women just simply reclining. And it doesn't look like much to us today, but a generation before this book was published, Black women, you did not have Black women characters in repose this way. What Larsen's doing here is breaking ground. I mean, no one had ever seen anything like this. I often teach this book in a course on African-American women's writing, and I teach it after I teach a book called Iola Leroy, L-E-R-O-Y, Iola, I-O-L-A, written in 1892 by a woman called Frances Harper, who was an abolitionist. She was an anti-lynching activist. She was a temperance activist. She was a writer, a public speaker, and one of the first Black woman novelists ever to be published. And her character is also a young Black woman with an ambiguous body and an ambiguous story, who actually doesn't realize that she is Black, or Black enough to be remanded to slavery once her white father dies. And she, receives an education as a result of the experience. And at the end of the book, she's the most upstanding, morally correct person you will ever meet. She is for the race, and the race is for her. There is no distinction between the self and the political struggle of Black people. She is so serious. It really, there's no room in her life for pleasure. And even when she gets married, it's really about uplifting the race, as a term went. Literally, race uplift work was what Frances Harper was doing in writing that novel, literally setting a path for Black people, less than a generation, from out of emancipation, right? Just 30 years, not even, when she publishes a book in 1892, I believe, 1892 and 87. She is trying to chart a way forward. And the way forward looks like a Black woman who is committed 24/7 to race progress. 35 years later, to have Nella Larsen sitting down and writing female characters who were not only very ambiguous morally, not even really likable. This was something no one had ever seen before. I mean, Frances Harper actually says in her book, Iola Leroy, we need novels to correct the racist portraits that have been disseminated, in the work of Joel Chandler Harris and all of the Uncle Remus stories, all of the stories depicting, the Black mammy, the Black person who is, who has no sense of morality, wisdom, integrity. We have to correct those portraits with our own. So there was a sense of writing as an extension of political work. And I think in the world of Black culture and Black culture producers, that debate still rages. For instance, think of an artist like Kara Walker, who periodically is taken out to be, chastised for making work that is disturbing, that does not conform to the kind of politics of respectability that has dictated a lot of the direction of Black cultural work since Black people were making art at all, you know. So for someone like Larsen to come along, she's a truly rebellious figure. And the rebellion is right here in these scenes where her characters are simply looking at each other and having conversations not about the future of the race, and smoking and enjoying themselves. This was seen as such a departure that critics would wage debates in the pages of Black newspapers. What does this mean? You know, what is this work doing? W.E.B. Du Bois wrote very famously in an essay called Criteria of Negro Art, an essay published in 1926. It's really easy to find. It's a very good teaching tool. He's very clear and deliberate. He says, I do not give a damn for any work of art that does not do the work of propaganda. You know, he's very clear about that. All art must do political work for it to matter. Now, he did appreciate this book. I mean, Du Bois himself was a very fine writer, and he understood, you know, he appreciated her skill. This actually annoyed her. She was really hoping that that the book would be reviled. For her, that was part of the pleasure. So I want you to see that, you know, in her kind of thumbing her nose at those expectations. She knows very well the kind of work that she's supposed to be producing, and she's doing something, you know, very different. I would like to talk just, I guess, just a little bit about the Netflix movie, which I think is wonderful. And it was so exciting, as I said, because to see this book that I love on the screen and to see it kind of processed through somebody else's and you know, really young person's imagination was really interesting. And I thought, good for Nella, you know. I felt great for her that she got this second chance with this book. But I think, of course, it's made for the screen because, you know, look at how she structures it. Literally, you know, it's in 3 acts. You know, she's thinking of it, thinking of those potentials, even as she's writing this book. And very easily then making it possible for us to think about race as performance and what she is doing there. But what I loved about it was that, for me, looking at the Netflix movie, the way that Tessa Thompson imagines Irene Redfield. I mean, a lot of this book, our eyes are trained on Claire because that's where Irene's eyes are trained, you know, on this magnetic creature that she doesn't even know, she loses words to describe Claire. And Tessa Thompson was she was, I loved her constant heaving. She was, we see Irene as somebody who's suffering, you know, and she's suffering from her bourgeois malaise. She's suffering from, you know, the burdens of being a subject of you know, of capitalism, right? I mean, she went from trying to find meaning in the things around her, and the things around her include even the Black women who work for her, Zulina and Sadie. And if you notice that, but I think it's very important, again, these interior spaces, there's so much choreography going on here. When you look at those passages, when Claire comes to Irene's house and she insists on going to the boys' room, you know, Irene has a very old-fashioned, you know, heavily kind of boundaried way of thinking about being a parent, and also about being the mistress, if you will, of the household. She doesn't interact with her servants, you know, as equals, but Claire bounds and is laughing with Zulina and Sadie. And I loved how the film gave Zulina and Sadie agency, you know, because they you see how they have this kind of, they have suspicion of Irene too. They kind of see through her, and she needs them as props. They make her feel valuable, that she has these servants that she doesn't speak to. And it annoys her that Claire insists on talking to them, because it kind of explodes the facade she has built in her life, and it makes it so clear. So when I think that's a really was a strong, for me, aspect of the movie, how it gives Irene some room, the things she can't articulate, but that she can act out, that we can see this character. She really is suffering and maybe deserves our compassion, because she is clearly overwhelmed by feelings she can't manage. And you know, the tension, I thought, was really well articulated between the two actors in the film. I want to say something about also in terms of what this book can do for us. It's really interesting on 42 when, Claire is goading her husband and saying, well, how do you know so much about Negroes anyway? And he says, I know people who've known them. This is on the third paragraph, 42. And, he says, I know them better than they know themselves, or he knows people better than themselves. And I read in the papers about them. And I was recently just in New York at the Schomburg, and I was looking through some newspapers in the 1930s, and there are actually some wonderful scrapbooks. I don't think they're available online, but certainly online, you can get access to Black newspapers, the Chicago Defender, Pittsburgh Courier. What I found that was stunning to me were looking at reports of lynchings in the mainstream press. These reports, you would think the person wanted to be lynched the way they're reporting these atrocities. I'd never been more stunned to see evidence of how, a story can be shaped in such a way to drain all truth out of it. Black newspapers had to provide counter narratives, and did, right? Report on the same lynchings and gave different kinds of information. So it might be interesting for students to look at some of these lynching reports and do literal comparisons. And again, you can find them, I think, even through the New York Public Library website. Unfortunately, and I must say, heartbreakingly, it is not hard to find these reports, right, in white newspapers and, if you will, mainstream newspapers and Black newspapers. They are everywhere, in this time period. You literally, you won't have to look very hard. And to think of Jack Ballou as someone who's consuming a certain kind of news is I think fascinating today when we think about how we are all consuming different media. Many of us asking, where does the truth lie? And if you're consuming a certain kind of news, of course, you develop certain kinds of ideas about people. And that is what's happened to Jack Ballou, of course. And he's open to that channel. And unbeknownst to him, he's, married to somebody and has a child with somebody, that one of the people he claims to absolutely despise, really, homicidally. He's the kind of rage that has clearly been, created and enhanced by the media he has consumed. And so it kind of then comes full circle because, Larsen is engaged in the same kind of project as a W.E.B. Du Bois, who establishes a crisis magazine in 1910 as a result of the fake news that's going on in mainstream media about Black people, the same fake news that Jack Ballou is consuming, and on and on and on. So, to think about who he is for us today, how he came to be, I think is really meaningful. As I said, the book is so much about its own time and fascinating and unnerving ways that it is about our time. We still are unsettled. What does race mean? What does it mean to be Black? What does it have to do with skin color? What does it have to do with, one's relationship to even one's own identity? The epigraph that Larsen uses at the beginning is a section of a very long poem by County Cullen, part of the same world. What is Africa to me? I don't know if anybody in this room has read Saidiya Hartman's brilliant book, Lose Your Mother, where she makes the journey and goes to Ghana. And it's literally, in some ways, asking that question, and it's quite a stunning book, beautifully written and not an easy read in the way that, Professor Hartman is just such a truth teller. But we're still asking this question, is what I'm trying to say. What do these things mean to us? These are not settled issues, our relationships with race, with identity itself. And in every way, this is a woman's novel. Claire's vulnerability as a Black woman who is trading in some ways on her sexuality, on her beauty. It's a hard game to play. And, we know what happens to her in the end. But as I said, I think this book it speaks to us today. We live in a moment when many of our young people refer with a straight face to Beyonce as a feminist, which I think is very interesting. And I wonder what Nella Larsen would say. But we think about what it means to own one's body, one's sexuality, but also when that same body is a platform for commerce. In some ways, it's what is the relationship between politics and money and identity and race? I mean, all of these things are here when I think about Claire Kendry and what she is, what she embodies. She embodies stories about the past, but also about the here and now.